that research to practice. So really, we had to continue adding to the science, but then we had to figure out how do we facilitate application of that list of things, because it's still kind of a list, right? Of this applied model. And so we really started thinking back in about 1997, how do we create then a self-assessment? How do we create tools that are going to facilitate planning around these things and then implementation of these things? So, you know, again, when we worked in communities, we would go up. When I first went to Kalamazoo, then the Battle Creek folks called me and they wanted me to come and help them figure out, you know, there is no sheltered workshop in our community. And so our kids have no place to go when they leave school. And it's like, why do you have a shelter? It's 2000 now. And what we, again, as you go from community to community, and I know that you've experienced this, is you're trying to write a student's IEP, right? Okay, we know these things should be in it, but how do you plan for supported employment for youth who need those kinds of supports when there are no supported employment service providers in your community? That's a problem. And so we started seeing, you know, real constraints about what people would work for in terms of outcomes because the services were not there to provide those supports. So there's this real important connection between thinking about what's the context of your community, developing individual IEPs, and preparing students for the future. Because if we see no employment opportunities in our community, why would we prepare students for employment? Let's start a sheltered workshop. Okay, so again, we sort of moved to expanding the taxonomy, so we did another extensive literature review back during that period, and we added and created our own. We got away from the fancy artwork because it didn't really tell people anything, just come back to kind of the basic layout. But we started then thinking, how do we apply this? So this is like an example of the paper planning that we started, and we developed this through New Mexico. It was actually field tested in New Hampshire. Has anybody been to New Hampshire? Back in like 1996, 1997. And so part of that was we would do this self-assessment part, so people in New Mexico would reflect on how well they were doing based on their data, but then there was no planning piece. And the school, the educators in the state said, you need to help us plan. So it's not just how well we're doing, we need to take that to the next step and plan how we do these things. So that's, again, thinking about the pragmatic aspects of what do you create in terms of effective practices. We have to be able to apply that. And so we started this paper planning model, and people started coming to institutes in several states. So Utah, Susan, they just had their, I don't know, 4th or 5th institute. Oklahoma just had their 9th or 10th or 11th or something like that. Arkansas probably just had their 5th or 6th. Rhode Island had their 5th. So people started bringing the teams. Georgia had several institutes, I think 3 maybe. Bringing teams of people together to say, here's the science, how are we going to apply it in our local context? And so they started writing goals that would help them to figure out, okay, we know that participation in one's IEP, engagement in that, is a strong predictor for students developing their self-determination and being successful. So gosh, let's focus a goal on doing that. So as we think about the Taxonomy 2.0 and moving to that, we had to continue to think about, okay, what is it that what context exists out there in which we're going to implement this stuff? And what are those questions that we get from the field, like, oh gosh, we don't have time to do transition because we have to do academics. So the question is, how do you do those things together? And what's in the taxonomy that really looks more broadly at the context these days? So over the last years, we've worked as NSTAC and then the National Dropout Prevention Center for Students with Disabilities and the National Coast Outcomes Center and others. Transition Coalition at Kansas, various various places around the country. We want to continue knowledge development. We want to continuously to review the literature. We're now looking at, instead of having to go back to Peters and Heron's model for identifying a best practice, we now have IES that gives us some standards that we can apply to this stuff. And a number of correlational studies and specific interventions have, again, emerged over that time. So you got to keep up with that, because we can't take something that was originally published in like 95 or 96, and it's the set it and forget it kind of model. So we have to keep adding those things to it. Okay, so then here's the 2009. We now move this planning process from working within a state and local districts to the state context. So again, our charge as a center is to work with state departments of education and VR specifically now to build capacity to implement these things. So again, we've had a paper model back in 2009. Many of you will go to these things, and the focus is again, okay, now on the practices, the science, but then the intervention, the implementation pieces of that. How do you do that in a state? So again, some people love this, some people hate this. It's a hard thing to do, I can tell you. It is painful. People in here will attest that it's painful to do. But most things that turn out really well are painful to do, and it's time consuming too. So again, we're still back to this challenge of linking what's all merged over all these years into practices and within the context of compliance, federal policy, those kinds of things. Okay, so what we've done in TACT, and partly feeding in from INSTAC and MPSO and the Dropout Center, is to thank again, just like I said, that new broader context that we find ourselves in. What are the academic interventions in relation to transition-focused education? How do we keep kids in school? Because we know from the research that kids that leave school successfully, graduation, fare much better than kids who don't. So the previous session that was in here, Deanne was talking about their work in juvenile justice. And again, if you look at dropping out and the postal outcomes of kids who drop out, many of them go to jail, right? Okay, that's not a valued outcome. At least not in most of your states and communities. It's not a valued outcome. So it's a real important piece of how we do this, because people are struggling with that. Vocational rehabilitation, success in post-secondary education. So we have a lot of programs popping up now that support kids with intellectual disabilities and other kids that access post-secondary education, people with hearing impairments, kids with learning disabilities, etc. How do we keep them? How do we retain them? Same question we have for all our kids in college. And then how do we move them on to graduation there with meaningful credentials and without too much student debt, right?
Yes.
Because you have to think. Okay, so here's a really big challenge when we think about post-secondary ed for kids. So number one, a lot of kids with disabilities, as they leave school, they don't want to be identified as having a disability, right? So they have to disclose themselves to their college services in order to get the supports provided in the Rehab Act and amendments. Okay, I'm gonna wait till I'm really struggling before I do that, because I don't like having to tell people I have a disability. Well, that's because they've learned that from high school, right? Or throughout the years. Okay, so what happens when you fail the course? What do you have to do? You have to take the course again, and if you fail it, you have to take it again. And what happens? You have to pay for it every time. So if you're thinking about the cost of higher education and of kids with disabilities and their families, they're going to leave with a tremendous amount of debt, because it's bad enough when you take each course one time. That's worse when you take them 2 or 3 times. So that's, again, a really important piece to look at as we think about how we support students in post-secondary ed. And then career tech ed and work-based education, because we know paid work experience is a predictor of post-school success for students. Okay, so what we did was we took the taxonomy, and again, because it's a living thing, we don't want it to be a set it and forget it, then we've added and we've updated, so we took all this work that really Catherine and David and their grad students and June and Matt Clare, who's in the dropout graduation arena, all of the research that's been generated, and went over that and made sure it's in here. If it wasn't in here, it got added. If it was sort of in here, we looked at what's that relationship of what's in there and what today's context is. So we want this to represent today's context. So family engagement rather than family involvement. We've changed that name. We've added a program characteristics, and these are really school program characteristics that foster keeping kids in school, foster engagement with families, foster collaboration, foster focus on student success. School climate has been added as well, because we know school climate is really important to keeping kids in school and to their success in school. We've added over here in student development, academic skills was always in there, but it wasn't out front, so to speak. So we've made it a piece of what's out front that you see. Life, social, and emotional skills, those were there, but we've updated the title to match about how we think about these things. And then the instructional context is there. So thinking about what that context is within the school, within your district, within your state, that supports student development. You know, certain things are like a perspective on universal design. So how do we make it so everybody learns better? So some of the others are still the same. Student-focused planning. It's really important that we have strong, good, meaningful IEPs. That the planning strategies engage students, families, rehab, others in that process. How do you make your IEP development process engaging and meaningful and not just a sign off on the paperwork? That's what we're talking about in there. And again, focusing on student participation in that. So that's what the Taxonomy 2.0 looks like. And you have a handout, and when you flip through the pages, you can start seeing all those 100 things that are organized into those categories, so you can see the very explicit practices within those categories, okay? So, again, we've added within that the dropout prevention, family engagement, graduation, human resource allocation in schools. I mean, is anybody here from Detroit? I thought I saw it. Okay, so Detroit used to have a transition specialist in all the high schools. Guess what? They don't have that anymore. That's gone. Michigan used to have a transition person in every intermediate school district. 67 of them, I think there were. Those are gone. So those are the kinds of things that really will affect your ability to deliver good services. But if you're not investing in those resources and in people's skills, competencies to do those things, you don't just automatically pluck out an elementary teacher and put them as a transition specialist, which I've seen happen in many places, because you like that person? No. Okay, so school scale up, climate, rehabilitation, instructional context, social emotional life skills, and then transition to post-secondary education employment. So these are where we've gone in and integrated those things more fully into this model that we hope living. And so when you, again, think back to the transition research and how the models and whatnot, we talk about these things sort of like we have the practices at the macro level, and these levels align with the predictors that we've worked with. So what's a macro level? It's a generic term. So self-determination skills, paid employment, family engagement, having a career counseling, having a transition plan. These are macro level practices. They're at the system level. Programs need to be providing these things, and they have these